Last year, we saw a warming between Australia and China when Prime Minister Anthony Albanese touched down in Shanghai, becoming the first Australian leader to visit China in 7 years. Here in Hong Kong, the city has long hosted a large Australian expatriate population, but a new tax residency proposal could affect that. Here to discuss this with me is Josephine Orgill, the new chair of the Australian Chamber of Commerce. Josephine, so great to have you in the studio with us.
Thank you, Laura.
As I just mentioned, so Australians, they make up a huge percentage of the expat community in Hong Kong. During the pandemic and post the national security law, we did see an exodus of people leaving for a variety of reasons. And the work visa data to date has showed that there has been sort of a trickle coming back. What are you seeing when it comes to talent returning to Hong Kong?
Yeah, there are certainly Australians and other expats either coming for the first time or coming back from other locations. I think we do need to bear in mind the job market and the difficult economic circumstances that we find ourselves in, and particularly across the border, which affects economies here and around the world. But there is also still a mixed perception on Hong Kong outside of Hong Kong, particularly, I would say. And it really takes, amongst other things, bringing people back to the city to see for themselves the operating environment that we have here.
And when you talk about the mixed perception, what do you think needs to happen to address that?
One of the best ways is bringing people here for sure, because a lot of the explanations around people's perceptions, reservations, are somewhat nuanced. So to give you an example, the Connect schemes, which are a critical pathway for international capital into China and also capital out of China for divestment of investment, very important for their growing pension needs, amongst other things, is predicated on the two systems. Without the two systems, that channel would be meaningless, unavailable, and as I've just mentioned, it's critical. But not many people outside of financial markets are familiar with the Stock Connect, Bond Connect, ETF, Swap Connect, and now Wealth Connect for the GBA. When I do explain that to people, it gives them a new appreciation for the relevance and the perpetuity of the critical differences in Hong Kong being different currency, no capital controls, and very importantly, separate and independent rule of law. But it doesn't make for a catchy headline. So there's a promotional effort required on that level. I think one of the things we can do is leverage the fantastic events that we have going on in the city, which I don't even see promoted heavily locally, let alone offshore. For example, we had the Hong Kong Golf Open recently with a stellar cast of professional players, but most people I spoke to didn't even know it was on. So why would people come to the city to see it? We've got Live Golf coming here in April, which in all other locations has been wildly popular and successful. So I hope we can do a good job around that. And then, of course, we have the Hong Kong Sevens, which is such a unique event that everybody loves. It's a fantastic opportunity to go out to the world and say, come back. You'll have the same fun you've always had, but also at the same time check out what's going on.
And food and beverage, they make up quite a big, significant portion of the Chamber's membership. But this has been an area where there has been challenges in attracting people and also getting people into the market in Hong Kong. What do you think needs to happen to kind of address that?
Yeah, I think the talent attraction schemes have served a certain purpose, but they haven't really addressed to date quite so successfully the needs in the food and beverage sector or in the construction sector, which is also important to our membership. So I think we need to work with the government to try to find some new initiatives there. Broadening apprenticeship schemes, for example, would be one suggestion, and also recognising skill sets that come from another jurisdiction, particularly in more technical areas like engineering.
Because, you know, this is part of one of the critical things that would drive, I guess, this key sector in Hong Kong, isn't it? The food and beverage.
Yeah, I mean, the world over, people are experiencing difficulties with staffing, I think, in this sector. So it's very competitive, actually. And the food and beverage sector is so important to Hong Kong. One of the things that people always comment on about living here or coming here is the variety of restaurants and the standard of the food. It's, I think it's an iconic part of Hong Kong, and it represents, everybody loves the local food, but the international food is also a feature. So we have to support that, and we have to make it viable from an economic standpoint as well to run these businesses. It's a combination of rent, the supply chain, and the staffing. The staffing is a really important component. Everybody knows and recognises good service. So I think it's something we absolutely have to foster to retain the culture of the city.
And as I mentioned in my intro, there is this new proposal to change tax residency rules in places including Hong Kong, and this would affect Australians living here. What kind of impact do you think that could have on Hong Kong?
So the proposed changes are to the tax residency rules in Australia, but it will impact expats most particularly. And without getting into the detail too heavily, the under the current proposal, the proposed changes will impact a high number of expats who would become Australian tax residents at the same time as being a Hong Kong tax resident. And it's particularly relevant to us in Hong Kong because we are one of the very few significant populations of Australian expats where the city or the country doesn't have a double taxation agreement. So Singapore, the UK, the US all have double taxation agreements. Hong Kong does not. So in our conversation with the Australian Treasury, we're promoting a tiebreaker provision that would make it more equitable for those in Hong Kong where they are genuinely a tax resident in that jurisdiction. And this is really important because if all of a sudden we have a low barrier to Australian tax residency for people legitimately living and working in Hong Kong, it will affect their decision on where to live. It will affect people's decision on whether to own property in Australia, whether to send their children to school there, whether to go on trips to Australia. But ultimately, as a business chamber, what worries us is the impact to Australian businesses here. If they have Australian employees that want to visit Australia for personal reasons and they're required to visit for business reasons, that becomes a huge constraint, or very expensive, or very complex to navigate. So it will make it very difficult for employers of Australians and to attract Australians to come to Hong Kong because their tax situation will be considerably simpler elsewhere.
And much has been made of the competition between Hong Kong and Singapore. Is the concern that this would be an extra thing that would push Australians in Hong Kong to Singapore?
Well, I might argue the only thing, Laura, but yes, it would be a significant consideration, as Singapore does have that double taxation agreement.
Thank you so much, Josephine, for joining us in the studio. It's been a pleasure having you, and you can learn more about this from our article on our website. You can find that at scmp.com.